My wedding day was supposed to be the most important moment of my life. Instead, I stood in my custom silk gown, staring at an empty church. Not a single member of my family showed up. Not my mother, not my sister, and definitely not my father, who had looked me in the eye just a week prior and promised to walk me down the aisle. They abandoned me to attend my sister's baby shower. But I did not cry. I got married, packed my bags, and the next morning I posted exactly one photo from my honeymoon on Instagram. Within an hour, I had 370 missed calls and texts from a panicking family who suddenly realized they had made the biggest mistake of their lives. If you are watching this, hit the like button and subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Stay tuned to hear how one photograph pushed my high society family to the absolute brink of bankruptcy. 2:00 in the afternoon. That was the time printed in gold foil on the heavy cardstock invitations I had mailed out months ago. I stood in the holding room of the First Presbyterian Church, staring at my reflection in an antique mirror. My dress was flawless, but the silence echoing off the stone walls was deafening. There was no mother fussing over my veil, no aunts laughing in the corner, and no father waiting by the door. I pulled my phone from my bridle clutch and dialed my father's number for the sixth time. Winston Davenport had sworn nothing would stop him from giving his eldest daughter away. The phone rang 3 times before clicking straight to voicemail. I ended the call, forcing a deep breath into my lungs. The heavy oak door creaked open. I did not turn around, assuming it was the wedding coordinator coming to deliver bad news. Instead, my fiancé Marcus stepped into the room. Marcus was a financial lawyer who navigated high-stakes corporate mergers. He handled billion-dollar crises without ever raising his voice, and he walked toward me with that exact same unshakable calm. He did not offer a meaningless platitude or a look of pity. He simply walked over and held out his iPad. I turned away from the mirror and looked at the screen. It was a live video streaming directly from my sister Chloe's social media account. The background was unmistakable. It was the Oak Ridge Country Club, a place my mother Josephine treated like her own personal kingdom. The screen was filled with familiar faces. My aunts, my cousins, my father, and my mother were all gathered around a massive multi-tiered cake surrounded by towers of expensive gifts. My mother was standing at the center of the room wearing a wide-brimmed fascinator hat and a tailored silk dress holding a crystal flute of champagne. I watched through the screen as she beamed with pride and spoke into a microphone. "Today is the most important day for the Davenport family legacy," she announced, her voice echoing through the country club. "Today we celebrate the upcoming arrival of a true heir. We celebrate my beautiful Chloe and her wonderful husband Preston." The camera panned to show Chloe wearing a designer maternity gown, resting a hand on a stomach that was barely even showing. Standing next to her was Preston, a white real estate heir who constantly used his family's wealth as a weapon to assert dominance over our family. He stood there with his hands in his pockets, looking down his nose at my relatives with an air of smug superiority. My father Winston was standing just behind them, holding a gift box, smiling weakly for the cameras. He was supposed to be here with me. Instead, he was standing in the background of a baby shower, holding expensive baby clothes. I stared at the iPad as the video continued to play. I watched my entire family raise their glasses to toast a baby that was not even due for another 7 months, all while my wedding ceremony was scheduled to begin in exactly 10 minutes. Marcus gently took the iPad from my hands without saying a word. My phone buzzed in my hand. A text message from Chloe lit up the screen. "Sorry, sis. Preston's family flew in from the Hamptons on their private jet to attend my shower. Mom said your civil ceremony is just at that small church, so it does not really matter if the bride's side is empty. You can just walk yourself up to the altar. Have a nice day." I read the message twice. The sheer audacity burned through me. They were not just ignoring my wedding, they were actively disrespecting it. My mother had dismissed my marriage as a cheap civil ceremony simply because Marcus and I had chosen not to spend $250,000 on a flashy party to impress her country club friends. Because I did not conform to Josephine's obsession with high society optics, I was deemed unworthy of her presence. I locked my phone and dropped it back into my clutch. I did not cry. The pain of being the family scapegoat was something I had swallowed for 32 years. But today the pain vanished, replaced entirely by a cold, calculated clarity. "Are you ready?" Marcus asked, his voice low and steady, as he offered me his arm. I looked at the man who actually chose me every single day. "I am ready," I said. "They do not deserve a seat at our table anyway." We walked out of the holding room and into the main vestibule. The traditional wedding march began to play from the organ and the heavy wooden doors swung open. The contrast inside the sanctuary was staggering. On the right side of the aisle, every single pew was filled with Marcus's family and our mutual friends. They were dressed beautifully, turning to look at us with warm, supportive smiles. On the left side of the aisle, the bride's side, there was nothing. Row after row of polished, empty wooden benches. It was a visual representation of my entire life within the Davenport family. A complete and utter void. But as I gripped Marcus's arm and began to walk down the aisle, I did not look at the empty seats. I looked straight ahead. I was not some helpless daughter waiting for a handout. I was the stealth founder of a massive property technology firm. I managed millions in private equity. I had paid my own way through Spelman College with a full academic scholarship, while my mother drained my grandfather's life insurance to buy Chloe a stake in a failing cosmetics brand. I did not need Winston Davenport to give me away. I belonged to myself. The ceremony was intimate and real. We exchanged rings and spoke vows we had written ourselves. When the pastor pronounced us husband and wife, the right side of the church erupted in cheers and applause. The empty left side did not matter. After the ceremony, we stepped back into the private vestibule. Marcus pulled me into a tight embrace, whispering how proud he was. As I pulled back to kiss him, my phone chimed loudly from inside my clutch. I reached in and pulled it out. The screen showed a notification from my banking app, followed immediately by a text message from a number I rarely interacted with. It was Preston. I opened the text message. It read, "Hey sister-in-law. Mother Josephine asked me to handle this. I just sent you $500 to cover the fee for renting that little church of yours. Consider it a wedding gift from the Kensington family. Do not embarrass us by leaving cheap bills unpaid. Go buy yourself a nice dinner." I stared at the screen. A notification from my bank popped up confirming a transfer of exactly $500 from Preston Kensington. The disrespect was so blatant, so perfectly aligned with Preston's toxic savior complex, that it was almost comical. He actually believed I was some struggling data IT worker who needed his charity to pay for a church venue. My mother had clearly painted a pathetic picture of me to her wealthy son-in-law, elevating her own status by stepping on my neck. She loved playing the generous matriarch while using Preston's money to assert dominance. Marcus leaned over my shoulder and read the message. A low chuckle escaped his chest. He shook his head, pushing his hands into his pockets. "He really has no idea, does he?" Marcus said, a slow smile spreading across his face. "He has absolutely no idea who he is talking to." "No," I said, my voice dangerously calm. "He does not, but he is going to find out very soon." I did not type out an angry response. I did not defend myself or reject the money. I simply opened the Davenport family group chat, where hours earlier they had been posting photos of Chloe's extravagant baby shower cake. I typed a brief response. "Thank you for the $500, Preston. It will go straight into the honeymoon fund. We are off to the airport now. Have a wonderful weekend, everyone." I hit send and immediately powered off my phone. I tossed it to Marcus, who slipped it into his jacket pocket. They had no idea where we were going. They assumed we were taking some budget road trip or staying at a cheap local hotel. They assumed my life was as small and insignificant as they treated me. "Let us go to the airport," I said, looking up at my husband. "We have a private jet waiting and a very expensive island calling our names." We walked out the back doors of the church into the bright afternoon sunlight, stepping into our waiting car. The war had just been declared, but the Davenport family was entirely unaware that they had just handed the ignition switch to the person who owned all the explosives. The Caribbean sun hit my face with a brilliant warmth that felt like absolute vindication. It was 9 o'clock in the morning on the island of St. Bart's. I was lounging on the expansive teak terrace of Le Rêve, arguably the most exclusive and heavily guarded royal villa in the entire Caribbean. The geometric infinity pool stretched out before me, its crystal clear water seamlessly blending into the vibrant turquoise ocean beyond the cliffside. Marcus was sitting across from me at the glass patio table, casually scrolling through global market reports on his tablet while sipping a freshly brewed espresso. There was no stress here. There was no anxiety. There was only the quiet hum of massive success and the gentle crash of the waves below. I reached for my phone, which had been resting face down on the table since we boarded our private jet the afternoon before. The moment I tapped the screen, it illuminated with a barrage of notifications from the Davenport family group chat. I opened the thread expecting to see a continuation of yesterday's circus, perhaps more photos of Chloe's ridiculous multi-tiered cake or her posing with her smug husband. Instead, I found a massive block of text from my mother Josephine sent just 20 minutes ago. "Good morning, family," Josephine wrote, her digital tone dripping with its usual aristocratic pretension. "I have a wonderful announcement to make. At the end of this month, our beautiful Chloe and her wonderful husband Preston will be flying out for their baby moon. Preston has generously booked the Royal Villa Le Rêve in St. Bart's for a full week. It is the most exclusive property on the island and costs an absolute fortune. But nothing is too good for my future grandson. Maya, since you clearly saved so much money by having a cheap little civil ceremony yesterday, I expect you to send a worthy gift for your sister's trip. Do not embarrass our family by being cheap. Send at least $5,000 to Preston's account to cover their private chef." I read the message twice, letting the sheer arrogance of her words wash over me. This was classic Josephine. Every major milestone in Chloe's life was weaponized to extract money and compliance from me. When Chloe graduated with a useless communications degree, my mother demanded I pay for a celebratory dinner for 30 people at a 5-star restaurant because I was already working a corporate job and needed to support my little sister. When Chloe demanded a destination bachelorette party in Tulum, my mother guilted me into covering the flights because I was the single older sister who had no real financial obligations. They never saw my hard work as an achievement. They saw my income as a communal family asset to be drained whenever Chloe batted her eyelashes. I did not feel angry. I felt a profound, almost intoxicating sense of amusement. I shifted my posture on the plush white cushions of my sun lounger. If my life were a movie, this would be the exact moment the camera panned a slow, dramatic 180 degrees around me, as I smoothly crossed my legs, adjusted my designer sunglasses, and let out a soft laugh. Marcus looked up from his tablet, raising a dark eyebrow. "Family drama," he asked, his voice a low, soothing rumble. I simply smiled and handed him my phone so he could read the message himself. Marcus scanned the block of text, a slow, sharp smile spreading across his handsome face. He let out a low whistle, setting the phone down on the table. "A baby moon at Le Rêve." Marcus said, his eyes glinting with predatory amusement. "That is going to be incredibly difficult for Preston to pull off, considering the property is no longer accepting public reservations." He was absolutely right. Le Rêve had been pulled from the luxury rental market exactly 3 weeks ago, when my property technology firm finalized the acquisition of the entire estate. I had purchased the villa as a personal investment and as a private sanctuary for our honeymoon. Preston Kensington, with all his generational wealth and loud boasting, had likely put down a preliminary deposit through a third-party island broker months ago. He was entirely unaware that the actual ownership of the estate was changing hands behind closed doors, and that all existing public bookings were about to be systematically canceled and refunded by my management team. I took my phone back from Marcus. I did not type out a defensive reply to my mother. I did not explain myself, argue about the exorbitant gift demand, or try to justify my wedding choices. Explaining myself was a habit for the old Maya, the daughter who desperately wanted to be seen. The woman sitting on this terrace had nothing left to prove to people committed to misunderstanding her. Instead, I opened my camera app. I framed the shot perfectly. In the foreground, my bare legs crossed elegantly over the pristine white lounger. In the midground, the iconic recognizable architecture of the Les Rêves Infinity Pool. In the background, the breathtaking sun-drenched view of the St. Bart's coastline. I snapped the picture. It was flawless. I opened Instagram. I attached the photo, applied a subtle filter to enhance the ocean's blue, and typed a short, precise caption. New owner inspecting the property. Perfect honeymoon at Le Rêve. I hit post. Then I copied the Instagram link and dropped it directly into the Davenport family group chat without a single additional word of context. I placed the phone back down on the glass table, picked up my mimosa, and took a slow, satisfying sip. 3 minutes passed in total blissful silence. The ocean breeze ruffled the leaves of the palm trees. Marcus watched my phone with mild anticipation. Then the device vibrated. Once. Twice. Suddenly, it began to emit a continuous, frantic buzzing sound that vibrated violently against the glass tabletop, sounding like an angry swarm of hornets. I watched the screen light up with a relentless stream of notifications. Missed call from Mother. Missed call from Chloe. Text from Aunt Martha Maya. What does this picture mean? Missed call from Preston. Text from Mother Maya. Pick up your phone right now. What kind of sick joke is this? Missed call from Winston. The notifications poured in like a digital avalanche. 10 missed calls. 50 missed calls. 150 missed calls. The counter just kept climbing, jumping by tens every few seconds. They were realizing what they were seeing. They were zooming in on the distinct architectural details of the pool that Preston had surely bragged about. They were reading the caption. They were putting the pieces together, and their collective reality was rapidly fracturing. For 32 years, my family had operated on a very specific rigid hierarchy. Josephine was the ruling queen. Chloe was the untouchable princess. Preston was the wealthy savior who validated their status. And I was the peasant allowed to exist in their orbit, only to serve as a contrasting background to their brilliance. My mother had built her entire social persona in her country club circle around the narrative that I was a struggling, bitter spinster who secretly envied Chloe's perfect life. She had likely spent the entire baby shower yesterday, telling anyone who would listen how sad it was that I had to settle for a cheap civil ceremony in a dusty church. Seeing me lounging at a multi-million-dollar private Caribbean estate, the exact estate her precious son-in-law had supposedly secured for his own grand gesture, completely shattered the fragile glass house of her ego. It was an assault on their carefully curated reality. By the time the clock on my screen hit 10:15, my phone displayed exactly 370 missed calls. The sheer volume of their panic was intoxicating. They were scrambling, terrified, and utterly confused. The phone began to ring again. Call number 371. The caller ID flashed Chloe's name in angry red letters. I looked at Marcus. He nodded, leaning back in his chair and taking another slow sip of his espresso, ready for the show. I swiped the screen and answered the call, putting it on speakerphone so the sound would carry clearly over the gentle ocean breeze. Maya Chloe's voice did not just come through the speaker, it erupted from it. She was screaming so loudly, the audio distorted into a shrill, hysterical shriek. "What the hell do you think you are doing? How dare you break into the villa?" Preston put a deposit on. I did not interrupt her. I took a leisurely sip of my mimosa, letting her scream into the void, letting her panic expose her deep-seated insecurity. "I did not break into anything, Chloe," I said, my voice smooth, calm, and utterly relaxed. "I am simply enjoying my honeymoon." "You are lying," she shrieked, her voice cracking with pure, unadulterated panic. "You are a liar. Preston booked Le Rêve for our baby moon. He paid a premium deposit to the international broker. You cannot even afford to be within 10 miles of that island, let alone step foot on that property. You must have bribed a pool cleaner to let you onto the terrace for a fake photo. I am warning you, Maya. I am going to call the island police right now and have you thrown out. You are going to be arrested for trespassing and thrown in a Caribbean jail." I held the phone slightly away from my ear as Chloe paused to take a ragged, furious breath. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my presence. I did not attempt to explain my financial status to a woman who had spent her entire life expecting me to bow to her whims. I simply looked up at the impeccably dressed man standing a few feet away from our patio table. Antoine was the general manager of Le Rêve. He had arrived 5 minutes earlier with a silver tray of fresh tropical fruit and had politely waited in silence while the screaming on my phone disrupted the serene morning atmosphere. I gestured toward the device resting on the glass table. Antoine stepped forward, leaning down gracefully toward the microphone. "Good morning, madame," he said, his voice carrying a crisp, incredibly polite French accent. "This is Antoine, the general estate manager at Le Rêve. I must sincerely apologize for any confusion you are experiencing, but Mrs. Davenport is not trespassing. In fact, she is our most honored guest." Chloe let out a sound of pure, unadulterated disbelief. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sudden uncertainty. "My husband, Preston Kensington, booked that royal villa. He paid the premium deposit to the international broker. You need to kick her out right now." Actually, Madame Antoine continued, his tone remaining perfectly professional despite the absolute devastation he was about to deliver. "Mr. Kensington did indeed attempt to place a hold on the property yesterday afternoon. However, the black card he provided on file was declined. It was run 4 separate times through our international merchant system. Each attempt resulted in an insufficient funds error." I watched Marcus bite the inside of his cheek, a silent gesture to stop himself from laughing aloud. The silence emanating from the speakerphone was absolute. I could picture the exact scene unfolding back in Oak Ridge. I could vividly picture my mother's face draining of blood as the people around her absorbed the undeniable fact that the wealthy Kensington family had just had their elite credit card bounce 4 times in a row. "But more importantly," Antoine added smoothly, crossing his hands behind his back, "Mr. Kensington could not have booked the villa regardless of his credit limit. The entire Le Rêve resort chain is no longer available for public or private rental. As of 5 o'clock this morning, the property was officially acquired by Apex PropTech Holdings. Mrs. Davenport is the founder and majority shareholder of that firm. She did not break in, madam. She owns the villa. She owns the entire island portfolio." There was a sudden violent shuffling sound over the speaker. Someone was aggressively snatching the phone out of Chloe's hands. "Listen to me, you pathetic fraud!" Preston roared into the receiver. His usual smug, condescending tone was entirely gone. It was replaced by the frantic, wild aggression of a man whose fragile ego had just been publicly kneecapped. "I do not know what kind of cheap stunt you are pulling, Maya, but you are playing with fire. The Kensington family has been in intense talks to acquire this resort group for 6 straight months. We have the capital. We have the elite backing. You are a glorified data worker who runs a little startup from her laptop." I picked up my mimosa, tracing the rim of the crystal glass with my index finger. "Go on, Preston," I said mildly, leaning back into my plush cushions. "You are using dirty credit," he sneered, his voice echoing loudly through the outdoor terrace. "You must have taken out some massive fraudulent loan to stage this little hostile takeover just to spite your sister. But you are way out of your league. My family practically built the commercial real estate market in our city. Josephine warned me about you. She told me you have always been bitter and jealous of Chloe. She told me you were so broke you could not even afford a proper wedding reception. And now you are committing corporate fraud to play pretend on a billionaire playground. I am calling my legal team right now. We are going to tie you up in so much aggressive litigation you will be bankrupt by Friday. We will rip your little tech company to shreds and have you thrown in a cell for wire fraud." I let his empty threats hang in the warm Caribbean air. I looked over at Marcus, my husband, the man who ruthlessly handled multi-billion-dollar corporate acquisitions before breakfast, simply smiled and nodded, giving me the floor. "Are you quite finished, Preston?" I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous icy register that commanded immediate authority. "You are dead," he breathed heavily into the phone, refusing to back down. "Let me explain a few crucial things to you about how real wealth actually operates. Preston?" I began, sitting up straight. You rely entirely on your grandfather's aging trust fund to maintain a lifestyle you absolutely cannot afford. You wildly leverage commercial properties you do not actually own to secure temporary credit lines you cannot pay back. Your family has been in talks to buy the resort group for 6 months because you have spent the last 6 months begging private equity firms to back your play. And every single one of them turned you down because the Kensington real estate portfolio is currently over-leveraged by 80%. Preston was completely silent. The heavy breathing over the line grew incredibly shallow. My little startup, as you call it, does not need private equity backing. I continued, my voice slicing through his manufactured arrogance like a scalpel. We are the private equity. My firm bought the massive debt of the holding company that owned Le Rêve. We did not just buy the resort Preston. We bought the bank that owns the resort. So when your black card bounced yesterday, my financial algorithms flagged it immediately. You are broke, Preston. Your family is swimming in toxic, unmanageable debt, while you attend country club baby showers, pretending you are financial royalty. I could hear a faint, high-pitched sound in the background on the other end of the line. It was my mother whimpering. She was finally realizing that the wealthy son-in-law she had worshipped, the man she had used to humiliate me at every family gathering, was nothing but a hollow shell of debt. All her boasting, all her pride, all her vicious comparisons between Chloe's perfect life and my supposedly pathetic one had been based on a massive financial lie. And as for your elite legal team, I added, leaning back against the white cushions and crossing my legs, I would not bother calling them. I received a very interesting email from the senior partners at Sterling and Vance this morning. It seems they officially dropped the Kensington family as a client at 9 o'clock today because you have failed to pay their retainer for 3 consecutive months. They are actually preparing to sue you for unpaid wages. The silence on the phone was absolute and heavy. The great Preston Kensington, the man who had smugly texted me $500 as a charity offering just 24 hours ago, was completely and utterly paralyzed. The man who loved to remind everyone that his family owned half the commercial real estate in the city had just been exposed as a massive fraud in front of his wife, his mother-in-law, and anyone else standing nearby at the country club. Enjoy the rest of the baby shower, I said smoothly, savoring the sweet taste of absolute victory. And Preston, do not make any other travel plans. I expect to see you and my entire family at Sunday dinner when Marcus and I return to the city. We have a lot of pressing financial matters to discuss. I tapped the red button on the screen, abruptly ending the call and cutting off whatever stuttering response he was trying to form. I set the phone down on the table and looked out at the turquoise water. The Caribbean sun felt warmer than ever, and the air tasted remarkably sweet. The heavy mahogany double doors of my parents' Oak Ridge estate were already open when Marcus and I arrived for Sunday dinner. We did not knock. We simply walked straight through the grand foyer and into the formal dining room. The long table groaned under the weight of a traditional Sunday spread of collard greens, candied yams, and smothered pork chops. But the air in the room was entirely toxic. No one had touched a single plate. My mother, Josephine, stood at the head of the table. Chloe and Preston sat to her right, looking completely frantic. My father, Winston, sat to her left, staring blankly at his empty china plate. The moment I stepped into the room, Josephine slammed her crystal wine glass onto the polished wood. The sharp crack echoed violently against the high ceilings. "Cancel the resort acquisition immediately!" Josephine ordered, her voice trembling with a mixture of absolute rage and sheer panic. "You will call your broker right now and reverse the sale. You are making a mockery of this family, Maya. You are deliberately humiliating Preston and his parents in front of the entire country club. Chloe is carrying a Kensington heir. That baby is the future of this family. It is our legacy, and you will not jeopardize our standing in this community with your petty, desperate jealousy." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I slowly walked forward, resting my hands flat on the dining table, leaning in to look my mother directly in the eyes. "The future," I asked, my tone dropping to a dangerous, icy register. "Is that the same legacy you were protecting when you secretly drained my savings account? The exact surplus money from my Spelman College full academic scholarship. You stole my living expenses to buy Chloe a Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag, simply so she could play pretend and fit in with a bunch of trust fund white girls at her sorority. Chloe gasped dramatically, pressing a hand to her chest. Winston finally looked up, his eyes widening in shock. He had not known about the money. You had a full ride, Josephine snapped, refusing to back down, though a flash of guilt briefly crossed her face. You were perfectly fine. You always managed to scrape by. Chloe needed to network. She needed to look the part to secure her place in high society and find a husband like Preston. It was an investment in our family's social capital. You were just going to waste that money on textbooks and rent. I worked 3 overnight shifts while carrying a 4.0 GPA just to afford food. I fired back, my voice slicing through her pathetic justification. You literally stole the money my grandfather left me for emergencies, so your golden child could carry a purse that cost more than my entire college tuition. You sold out my hard work to buy your way into white elite circles that still laugh at you behind your back. Preston slammed his fist on the table and stood up, trying to project the dominant aura of a wealthy patriarch. He failed miserably. His face was flushed and a vein throbbed visibly in his neck. You do not speak to my mother-in-law that way, Preston roared, pointing a shaking finger at me. You got lucky with one tech buyout, Maya, but you are playing a dangerous game in a league you do not understand. You are nothing but a glorified IT worker using dirty credit to pull a fast one. My father is making calls right now. We are going to bury your little startup in so much aggressive litigation you will be begging to settle. Cancel the resort purchase and transfer the deed to my holding company by tomorrow morning, or my legal team will tear your life apart. Marcus slowly unbuttoned his suit jacket and stepped up beside me. He did not yell, he did not posture. He simply reached inside his breast pocket and pulled out a sleek black folder, tossing it onto the center of the table. Actually, Preston, your father is not making any calls, Marcus said, his voice an incredibly calm, soothing rumble that somehow carried more threat than Preston's screaming. His phone lines were disconnected this morning, along with his access to all his corporate accounts. Preston froze. His outstretched hand slowly dropped to his side. What are you talking about? He breathed. Generational wealth is a fascinating concept, Marcus continued, casually leaning against the back of my chair. It only works if the current generation actually knows how to manage it. Your family has been taking out massive predatory loans to cover up the fact that your commercial real estate portfolio has been hemorrhaging money for 5 years. Your father put up the Kensington Trust Fund as collateral. On Friday afternoon, Maya's firm bought that exact debt portfolio. As of this morning, the Kensington family is officially in default. You do not have a legal team anymore, Preston. You do not even have a trust fund. Chloe let out a loud, piercing wail. She turned to my father, grabbing his arm frantically. Daddy, do something, she cried, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face. Tell her to stop. She is ruining my life. Preston promised me a house in the Hamptons. Tell Maya to give the resort back right now. Winston looked at me. His eyes were pleading, filled with the tired desperation of a man who had spent his entire life taking the path of least resistance. Maya, please, he said, his voice cracking. We are family. You have made your point. You proved you are successful. Now be the bigger person and fix this. Give Preston the resort contract. We can pool our resources and save the Kensington portfolio. Do not destroy your sister's future. I stared at the man who was supposed to be my protector. The final thread of my childhood attachment to him snapped cleanly in two. Be the bigger person. I repeated the words, tasting bitter on my tongue. Like you were the bigger person when you promised to walk me down the aisle. You looked me in the eye and swore to me that nothing would stop you from being there for your eldest daughter. But the second Josephine handed you a gift box and told you to stand in the background of Chloe's live stream, you folded. You abandoned me in an empty church to hold baby clothes for a man who actively despises you. You have always folded, Dad. You do not want me to be the bigger person. You just want me to lay down and be the floor mat this family wipes their feet on, so you do not have to deal with Josephine's shouting. How dare you speak to your father that way? Josephine shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. You are an ungrateful, bitter woman. We do not need your money. We do not need your resorts. The Davenports have our own legacy. We have this estate. We have our own solid ground. We will help Preston and Chloe ourselves, and you will be permanently cut out of this family. I looked at my mother. I looked at the grand chandelier hanging above her, the expensive art on the walls, the custom silk drapes framing the windows. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. "Solid ground?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. "That is a truly fascinating choice of words, Mother. Because when I acquired the Kensington debt portfolio, I found something else bundled in the collateral, something highly irregular." Josephine suddenly stopped breathing. The color completely drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and hollow. Marcus tapped the black folder on the table. "Why do you not open it, Josephine?" he suggested mildly. "Do you want to tell Dad what you secretly leveraged to pay for Chloe's $250,000 wedding?" I asked, my voice echoing in the dead silence of the room. "Or should I tell him exactly how many millions you secretly mortgaged against this very house to bail out Preston's failing investments last year?" Winston turned his head so slowly toward his wife that his neck seemed to visibly strain under the weight of the motion. The silence in the dining room became a physical pressure, suffocating and absolute. Josephine opened her mouth, her perfectly painted lips parting, but no sound came out. The aristocratic mask she had worn for 3 decades was actively dissolving, leaving behind a terrified, hollow-eyed woman who had finally run out of lies. Preston could not handle the shift in power. He could not tolerate the reality that the narrative was no longer bowing to his generational wealth. He pushed his heavy mahogany chair back so violently it screeched against the hardwood floor. He stood up to his full height, his face flushed a mottled, angry crimson, and violently yanked at the knot of his designer silk tie to loosen it. It was a textbook display of manufactured alpha male dominance, a desperate attempt to use his inherent privilege to crush a situation he could no longer control. "Listen to me, Maya," Preston commanded, his voice thick with unearned authority and dripping with condescension. "I do not know what kind of dirty back-alley tricks you used to pull this off. I do not know what legal loophole you exploited to put your name on that resort deed. You are just a lowly IT data girl. You type lines of code for a living. You do not understand commercial real estate, and you absolutely do not understand the high-stakes financial arena you just stumbled into." I did not answer him immediately. My hand moved smoothly across the table, my fingers wrapping around the stem of my crystal wine glass. The camera of my own mind tracked the movement, catching the dark red liquid swirling gently as I lifted it. I took a slow, deliberate sip, my eyes never leaving Preston's furious, sweating face. The wine tasted remarkably sweet. "You got lucky." Preston continued, misinterpreting my silence as hesitation. "You found an opening and you took it fine. But this game is over. You are going to sell that resort back to my family's investment fund right now. I will cut you a check today. I will pay you double whatever fraudulent leverage you used to acquire it. Take the cash, Maya. Take your little win, go back to your cubicle, and leave the real business to the adults before you get hurt." The sheer audacity of the bluff was staggering. He was standing there, financially gutted, his family's empire burning to the ground, and he was still trying to buy me off with money he did not possess. He was relying entirely on the assumption that I was intimidated by his name, his gender, and his skin color. He truly believed that if he shouted loud enough, the world would automatically align with his demands. Before I could even lower my wine glass to deliver a response, a sound broke the tension in the room. It was a laugh. It was not a chuckle or a polite scoff. It was a rich, deep, resonant laugh that erupted from Marcus's chest. The sound was incredibly genuine, entirely relaxed, and carried the heavy weight of absolute amusement. Marcus leaned back in his chair, shaking his head slightly, his broad shoulders shaking with genuine mirth. Preston snapped his attention away from me and locked onto my husband. The vein in Preston's forehead bulged dangerously, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "What exactly are you laughing at?" Preston spat, his voice dropping to a dangerous, guttural sneer. "You think this is funny? You think corporate acquisition is a joke? I know exactly who you are, Marcus. You are a nobody. You are a mid-level attorney clawing for billable hours. Do you have any idea who you are dealing with?" Marcus did not stop smiling. He casually rested his elbows on the armrests of his chair, interlacing his fingers. He looked at Preston the way a scientist might observe a particularly loud, frantic insect trapped under a glass. I can make one phone call, Preston threatened, leaning over the table, his knuckles turning white against the polished wood. One call to my connections on Wall Street, and I will bury your entire legal career. I will have you disbarred. I will make sure no respectable firm in this country ever looks at your resume again. You are a broke, arrogant loser who married into a family he does not understand. Shut your mouth and tell your wife to sign the resort over, or I will ruin you both. The room held its collective breath. Chloe was openly weeping now, her face buried in her hands. Josephine was gripping the edge of the table so tightly her fingers looked bloodless. Winston remained frozen, trapped in a state of catatonic shock. Marcus stopped smiling. The amusement drained from his handsome face, replaced by a cold, clinical precision that instantly commanded the room. He reached up with one hand and smoothly removed his custom-framed glasses, folding them neatly and placing them on the table next to his pristine linen napkin. "What a truly fascinating coincidence," Marcus said. His voice was low, incredibly smooth, and completely devoid of fear. Preston blinked, clearly derailed by the utter lack of panic in Marcus's response. "What is he?" demanded defensively. Marcus leaned forward, his dark eyes locking onto Preston with the intensity of a predator who had finally cornered its prey. "You threatening to use your Wall Street connections to ruin my career?" Marcus stated, pronouncing each word with surgical clarity. "That is fascinating because my law firm does not handle low-level civil disputes, Preston. We specialize in international corporate restructuring and aggressive asset liquidation. And my senior partners just finalized a massive non-negotiable portfolio seizure early this morning." Preston's mouth opened slightly, the aggressive posturing suddenly melting into genuine confusion. "What are you talking about?" "I am talking about the Kensington estate," Marcus replied, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the definitive weight of an executioner's axe. "My firm represents the consortium of international banks that just seized your family's entire holding company. As of 6 o'clock this morning, your accounts are frozen. Your properties are in receivership. The cars you drove here today technically belong to the bank. I do not just know who you are, Preston. I literally own the legal rights to your financial ruin." Preston staggered backward, physically recoiling as if he had been struck. He bumped into the edge of his heavy dining chair, his legs suddenly struggling to support his weight. The red flush of anger vanished from his face, leaving him looking sickly and pale. "You are lying," Preston gasped, his voice thin, reedy, and completely stripped of its former power. My father would have told me. We have safety nets. We have offshore accounts. Your father was officially removed from his position as CEO by a federal receiver 3 hours ago," Marcus stated coldly, refusing to break eye contact. "There are no safety nets. The offshore accounts were liquidated to cover the massive penalties incurred by your fraudulent loan applications. You have nothing left to leverage, Preston. You cannot buy my wife's resort. You cannot buy my career. You cannot even afford the gas required to drive that leased European sports car back to your heavily mortgaged mansion. Wall Street does not save bankrupts, Preston. It consumes them." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dynasty collapsing into dust. I looked at my mother. Josephine was staring at Preston, her eyes wide with a horrific realization. The wealthy, aristocratic savior she had used to humiliate me, the man she had secretly drained her own husband's assets to protect, was completely destitute. The golden ticket she had bought for Chloe was entirely worthless. Chloe let out a choked, desperate sob, grabbing Preston's arm. "Tell me he is lying, Preston," Chloe shrieked, shaking his sleeve. "Tell me we still have the trust fund. What about the baby? What about the country club?" Preston did not look at her. He could not look at her. He stared blankly at the mahogany table, his mouth working silently, utterly broken by the crushing weight of his newly discovered reality. I picked up my napkin, dabbed the corners of my mouth with elegant precision, and stood up from the table. Marcus stood immediately beside me, a solid, immovable mountain of quiet power. "Thank you for dinner, Mother," I said, looking down at Josephine's shattered, tear-streaked face. It was incredibly illuminating. "I suggest you call a real estate broker first thing tomorrow morning. You are going to need a very aggressive strategy to save this house before the banks come looking for the collateral you signed away. I turned to my father, who was still staring blankly at the wall, unable to process the total destruction of his life's work. Take care of yourself, Dad, I said softly. I turned my back on the wreckage of my family. Marcus placed a warm, protective hand on my lower back, guiding me out of the dining room. We walked back through the grand foyer, our footsteps echoing against the marble floors, leaving behind the screaming, the crying, and the complete financial annihilation of the Davenport family hierarchy. The heavy mahogany doors shut behind us with a loud, definitive click, sealing them inside their ruined world, and leaving us standing free in the bright, unfiltered sunlight. The deafening silence in the formal dining room was abruptly shattered by a violent, unexpected eruption from my father. Winston, a man who had spent the last 3 decades shrinking into the expensive wallpaper of his own home to avoid conflict, suddenly slammed his fist down onto the polished mahogany table. The silverware rattled against the fine china. "Shut your mouth!" Winston roared, his voice cracking with the strain of unfamiliar authority. He pointed a trembling finger directly at Marcus. "You do not come into my house and threaten my son-in-law. You are a guest at this table. Preston is family. I will not sit here and listen to you spin ridiculous lies to humiliate him just because you are intimidated by his success." The camera lens of my focus zoomed in tight, a slow, deliberate push into the sheer panic dilating my father's eyes. He was not defending Preston out of love. He was defending the fragile, manufactured reality that kept his own life comfortable. If Preston was a fraud, then Josephine's entire social empire was a lie, and Winston would have to deal with the catastrophic fallout. He was desperately trying to assert a patriarchal dominance he had never actually possessed. Marcus did not flinch. He did not even blink. He simply stared at Winston with an expression of profound, chilling indifference. But I did not let my husband answer. This was my table now. This was my moment. I reached down into the oversized designer leather tote resting by my feet. My fingers wrapped around a thick, heavy stack of legal documents bound by a single industrial-grade silver clip. I pulled the dense stack of paper out and lifted it above the table. I locked eyes with Chloe, whose smug, arrogant expression had frozen into a mask of nervous confusion. I flicked my wrist. I slammed the stack of files onto the table and pushed them hard. The heavy documents glided rapidly across the smooth mahogany surface. They clipped a crystal water goblet, sending it tipping over, and slid straight into Preston's pristine porcelain plate. The thick stack of legal contracts crashed violently into his slow-roasted smothered pork ribs. Dark, heavy barbecue sauce and grease instantly splattered across the crisp white pages, staining the financial seals of the Kensington Family Trust. "I do not do IT data, Chloe," I said, my voice echoing off the high ceilings with a razor-sharp, absolute clarity. "I am the secret founder and majority shareholder of Onyx PropTech. And your husband's great untouchable family just had their $40 million bad debt completely bought out by my fund." The entire dining room instantly turned to stone. The air was sucked out of the space, leaving behind a vacuum of sheer suffocating terror. Chloe stared at the grease-stained legal documents resting on top of the ribs, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. She slowly turned her head to look at Preston. Her eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, desperate horror. She was waiting for him to laugh. She was waiting for him to stand up, flip the table, and threaten to sue me for defamation. She was waiting for the wealthy, powerful white tycoon she had married to assert his dominance and put her dark-skinned, supposedly inferior sister back in her place. Preston did nothing of the sort. The blood had completely drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent gray. The arrogant sneer that had defined his features since the day I met him was entirely gone. He stared down at the documents, his eyes locking onto the bold black logo of Onyx PropTech stamped at the top of the ruined pages. He knew that logo. He had likely been receiving automated rejection emails from my corporate acquisition team for the past 6 months. Suddenly, the illusion of his supreme privilege shattered. Preston's knees seemed to give out beneath the table. He physically collapsed backward, dropping heavily into his upholstered dining chair, like a marionette whose strings had been violently cut. A thick layer of sweat broke out across his forehead, beating rapidly and rolling down his temples. He raised a shaking hand desperately, trying to loosen his expensive silk tie, gasping for air, in a room that felt entirely devoid of oxygen. "Tell her she is lying, Preston," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling so violently it was barely audible. "Tell her she is a bitter liar. Tell them about the Hamptons house. Tell them about the trust fund." Preston did not look at her. He could not look at her. He just kept staring at the barbecue sauce soaking into his financial ruin. "He cannot tell you that, Chloe," I said, leaning back in my chair and crossing my arms because the trust fund does not exist anymore. It was liquidated 3 days ago to cover a fraction of the predatory loans his father took out to keep their commercial properties afloat. The Kensington family name is a dinosaur. It is an outdated brand built on old money that dried up a decade ago. They have been surviving on lines of credit using their country club status to convince secondary lenders they were good for the cash. I paused, letting the devastating truth sink deep into my mother's consciousness. Josephine was gripping the edge of the table, her knuckles white, her breathing shallow and erratic. But secondary lenders have zero patience for toxic assets. I continued, my voice smooth and unrelenting. When Preston's father defaulted on a $10 million balloon payment last month, the lenders panicked. They packaged the entire $40 million Kensington debt portfolio and sold it at a massive discount just to get it off their books. My algorithms flagged the sale. "I bought your husband's entire generational legacy for pennies on the dollar, Chloe. I own the deed to his properties. I own the title to his cars. I own the roof over your head." You cannot do this." Preston choked out, his voice a pathetic, reedy wheeze. His hands were shaking so violently that they rattled against the armrests of his chair. "You do not have the authority." Your lawyers were fired this morning," Marcus reminded him coldly. "I told you that already, Preston. Do try to keep up." Josephine suddenly stood up. The regal, untouchable matriarch was gone, replaced by a scrambling, desperate woman watching her entire social identity burn to ash. "Maya," Josephine said, her voice dropping into a sickeningly sweet, placating tone that made my stomach churn. "Maya, sweetheart, listen to me. If you really own this company, if you really have this kind of money, then this is wonderful news. We are family. You can fix this. You can transfer the debt back to Preston. You can clear their accounts. Chloe is pregnant. She is carrying a Kensington. You cannot let the father of your future niece go bankrupt. We will merge your company with their properties. We will keep it all in the family." I looked at the woman who had birthed me, truly marveling at her bottomless capacity for delusion. She was literally standing in the wreckage of her own arrogance, and her first instinct was to demand I use my hard-earned empire to bail out the white man who had mocked me 30 minutes ago. "Merge my company?" I asked, letting out a short, sharp laugh that cut through the room like a whip. "Merge it with what, Josephine?" "He has nothing. He is a financial black hole. And as for helping family, that is a truly fascinating concept coming from you." I stood up, placing my palms flat on the table, mirroring the aggressive posture my father had attempted earlier, but backing it with actual, undeniable power. Where was this fierce dedication to family? When I was 19 years old, I demanded, my voice rising, filling the room with the raw, suppressed anger of a teenager who had been deeply betrayed. Where was this loyalty when you secretly accessed my bank account? You drained every single cent of the surplus stipend I earned from my Spelman College full academic scholarship. You stole the money I needed for food and rent, and you used it to buy Chloe a Himalayan crocodile Birkin bag. Chloe flinched, shrinking back into her chair. "You told me I was being selfish for wanting to keep my own scholarship money." I continued, keeping my eyes locked on Josephine's terrified face. "You told me Chloe needed that purse to fit in with the wealthy white girls at her sorority. You told me it was my duty to sacrifice my education so she could secure a wealthy husband and elevate this family. Well, congratulations, Mother. She secured him. She married a man whose entire financial portfolio is currently soaking in pork grease on his dinner plate. Josephine opened her mouth, her eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an excuse, a manipulation, any lie that could save her from the absolute humiliation of the truth. But there was nowhere left to run. Winston was staring at her in horror, finally realizing the depths of her deception regarding my college finances. "You spent my entire life calling me a disappointment," I said, my voice dropping back to a lethal, quiet calm. "You told your friends I was a failure because I did not have a husband by 25. You mocked my career. You dismissed my intelligence. You treated me like a peasant in my own home, so Chloe could play the princess." I reached down and picked up my purse, slinging it over my shoulder with a smooth, practiced motion. "But the funny thing about being ignored," I added, looking down at Preston, who was now resting his head in his hands, completely broken, "is that nobody watches you while you build your empire. Nobody sees you coming until it is far too late." Marcus stepped back, opening the path to the door for me. He looked at Winston, then at Josephine, his expression etched with pure disgust. "We will be sending an official notice of foreclosure to your daughter's residence on Monday morning," Marcus stated formally. "I suggest you use whatever remains of your personal savings to hire a moving truck." I turned my back on the dining room, walking away from the stale food, the ruined documents, and the shattered illusions of the Davenport family. I did not look back at Chloe's tears. I did not listen to Josephine's sudden desperate pleading. I walked out of the house with my head held high, the heavy front doors closing behind me, sealing them inside a prison of their own making. The absolute stillness in the room was suffocating. Every molecule of air seemed to have been sucked out the moment the word mortgaged left my lips. My father, Winston, remained entirely frozen. His eyes moved mechanically from my face to the black folder Marcus had tossed on the table, and finally to the pale, trembling figure of his wife. "Josephine!" "What the hell are you talking about?" Winston asked. His voice was no longer the passive, agreeable hum that had echoed through the halls of my childhood. It was a raw, scraping whisper that sounded like stones grinding together. Josephine swallowed hard. She looked at Preston, her eyes begging him to intervene, to use his wealth and status to shield her from the impending devastation. But Preston was slouched in his chair, staring blankly at his ruined dinner, completely paralyzed by the reality of his own financial annihilation. He had nothing left to offer her. "I asked you a question!" Josephine Winston roared, slamming his hands flat against the mahogany table. The fine china clattered, and a crystal water glass tipped over, spilling a dark stain across the pristine white linen tablecloth. "What did you do to this house? This estate is the blood, sweat, and tears of my grandparents. They worked themselves to the bone through segregation. They fought tooth and nail against banks that refused to lend to Black families just to secure this land. They built this legacy so we would never have to bow to anyone. Tell me you did not put their sacrifice on the line for this boy." Josephine opened her mouth to lie. I could see the instinct firing in her eyes, the lifelong habit of spinning truth into a more flattering narrative. But the black folder sitting between us contained the indisputable evidence of her betrayal. The bank records, the forged signature authorizations, the secondary loan agreements. It was all there. She physically crumbled. The aristocratic posture she had maintained for decades dissolved in an instant. She sank heavily into her chair, her shoulders folding inward as a harsh, ugly sob tore from her throat. She gripped the edge of the dining table, her perfectly manicured fingernails digging into the wood as if trying to keep herself from falling into an abyss. "It was a bridge loan," Josephine wept, the words spilling out in a frantic, desperate rush. "Preston came to me last October. He said the Kensington Fund was restructuring. He said it was just a temporary cash flow issue, and he needed collateral to secure a $5 million line of credit. It was just a signature, Winston. It was just a piece of paper. He promised the bank would never actually call the loan. You forged my signature to leverage a $5 million loan against my family home." Winston breathed, taking a slow step backward, as if the woman sitting in front of him had suddenly transformed into a monster. "You put the roof over our heads up as collateral, for a man who has never worked a day of hard labor in his entire life." "He promised me shares!" Josephine cried, her voice reaching a hysterical pitch. Her meticulously styled hair fell across her tear-streaked face. "You do not understand how these things work, Winston. We have money, yes. We have this big house. But to them, to the people in Preston's world, we are just new money. We are just lucky. We do not have a seat at the real table." Preston swore to me that if I guaranteed the loan, he would draft an irrevocable contract transferring 10% of the Kensington family holding shares directly into Chloe's name the moment she gave birth to their first child. I stared at my mother, entirely repulsed by the sheer depth of her self-loathing. The truth laid bare was uglier than I had imagined. "You sold out your own heritage," I said, my voice slicing through her sobbing with icy precision. "You took the generational wealth built by brilliant, hardworking Black men and women, and you handed it over to a white trust fund baby because you thought his last name carried more value than your own. You wanted to buy your way into an aristocracy that laughs at you. You risked leaving your husband homeless just to secure a 10% stake in a dying empire. And the most pathetic part, Mother," I continued, leaning forward to ensure she heard every single syllable, "is that you did not even buy a real asset. You mortgaged your soul for a bankrupt shell company." Preston did not have any shares to give Chloe. The Kensington holdings were already leveraged to the hilt. He used your $5 million to pay off his most aggressive creditors just to keep himself out of federal prison for another 6 months. He played you for an absolute fool. Chloe let out a piercing shriek. She turned to Preston, her hands flying to her face in horror. "You lied to us!" Chloe screamed, hitting his shoulder frantically. "You told me my baby would be an heir. You told me we were building a dynasty. You used my mother to steal from my father." Preston weakly tried to push her hands away, his eyes darting around the room, searching for an exit. "I was going to fix it," Preston stammered, his voice cracking. The market shifted. The commercial real estate sector took a dive. I just needed a little more time to turn the portfolio around. I was going to pay the $5 million back before the bank ever noticed. Winston stopped listening. The man who had spent his entire marriage taking the path of least resistance, the father who had allowed his eldest daughter to be emotionally abused just to keep the peace in his household, finally reached his breaking point. The realization that his wife had stripped away his family's sacred legacy to purchase the approval of a man who viewed them as nothing more than disposable assets shattered his passive facade completely. Winston lunged forward. He bypassed the head of the table in 3 long, furious strides. Preston saw him coming and scrambled to stand up, his heavy chair scraping violently against the floorboards. "Mr. Davenport, please, you have to understand business," Preston started to say, raising his hands in a pathetic gesture of defense. Winston did not want to understand business. He swung his arm with a raw, unbridled fury that carried the weight of 30 years of suppressed humiliation. The open palm of his hand struck Preston squarely across the left side of his face. The sharp, explosive crack of the impact echoed like a gunshot through the dining room. The force of the blow lifted Preston entirely off his feet. The so-called titan of generational wealth crashed backward into the custom silk drapes, tearing the heavy fabric from the rod before collapsing onto the hardwood floor in a tangled, pathetic heap. Preston grabbed his face, groaning in pain, a dark red welt already forming across his pale cheek. Winston stood over him, his chest heaving, his fists clenched so tightly, his knuckles were stark white. He turned slowly, his eyes locking onto Josephine. The rage radiating from my father was absolute. He had lost everything. His home, his legacy, the illusion of his marriage. Josephine screamed, throwing her hands over her head and shrinking back into her chair as Winston took a deliberate, menacing step toward her. He raised his hand again, his eyes dark with a violent, consuming betrayal. He was going to strike her. He was going to inflict the physical pain that matched the financial devastation she had brought upon their lives. Before Winston's hand could fall, Marcus moved. My husband was incredibly fast, stepping smoothly between my father and my mother. Marcus reached out, his large, strong hand clamping firmly around Winston's raised wrist. Marcus did not use violence, but his grip was an immovable vice of absolute authority. "Do not do it," Winston Marcus said. His voice was a low, steady rumble that commanded the chaos of the room to immediately cease. Do not give them a single reason to call the police and turn you into the aggressor. She is not worth losing your freedom over. You have already lost your house. Do not lose your dignity. Winston stared at Marcus, his chest rising and falling heavily. Slowly, the violent tension drained from his shoulders. His arm went limp. Marcus released his grip, stepping back, but remaining close enough to intervene if necessary. Winston looked down at his wife, who was sobbing hysterically into her hands, entirely broken by her own monstrous vanity. Then he looked at Preston, who was cowering on the floor, bleeding from his lip and whimpering about pressing charges. Finally, my father turned to look at me. His eyes were hollow, filled with a crushing, infinite regret. He realized far too late that he had spent his life protecting the wrong people. He had allowed his wife to destroy the only daughter who had actually built something real. "Get out of my house," Winston said. The command was not directed at me. He looked at Josephine, his voice completely devoid of emotion. "Winston." "Please," Josephine begged, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. "Where will I go? We are married. We can fight this together. I am not fighting for a woman who mortgaged my soul to buy a seat at a white man's table," Winston replied, turning his back on her completely. "Pack whatever fits in a single suitcase and get out before I call the authorities and have you arrested for forging my signature on federal loan documents. Take your golden child and her bankrupt husband with you." I stood silently watching the absolute destruction of the toxic hierarchy that had ruled my life. I had not needed to raise my voice. I had not needed to throw a single punch. I had simply laid the truth on the table and allowed their own greed to consume them. "Let us go home," Maya Marcus said softly, resting a warm hand on my shoulder. "We have a foreclosure to finalize on Monday." I nodded, slipping my arm through his. We walked out of the Oak Ridge estate, leaving behind the ruins of a fake dynasty. The crisp evening air hit my face the moment we stepped outside, and for the first time in my entire life, I took a deep, unobstructed breath. The debt was collected, the legacy was mine, and the slate was finally beautifully clean. Winston slowly lowered his hands to the table, his breath hitching in his chest. The silence in the dining room became a physical pressure, suffocating and absolute. He turned his head toward his wife, his eyes searching her terrified face for a denial that was never going to come. The grand aristocratic mask Josephine had worn for 3 decades was actively dissolving, leaving behind a hollow-eyed woman who had finally run out of lies. My focus narrowed, my vision tracking with cold, mechanical precision as I slowly closed the distance between myself and the woman who had birthed me. I did not rush. I walked forward with a steady, rhythmic cadence, my heels clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. Every step I took seemed to drain another ounce of oxygen from the room. Josephine could not maintain eye contact. She looked at Preston silently, begging him to intervene, to use his supposed wealth and status to shield her from the impending devastation. But Preston was slumped in his chair, completely paralyzed by the reality of his own financial annihilation. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling violently against his knees. He had nothing left to offer her. He was a fraud, and Josephine had bet everything on him. When she realized no one was coming to her rescue, Josephine physically crumbled. The wealthy, untouchable matriarch of the Davenport family vanished. She sank heavily to the floor, her knees hitting the hardwood with a dull thud. Her custom-tailored silk dress pooled around her like a deflated parachute as she turned to face me. She abandoned every shred of her patrician dignity, reaching out with manicured hands to grasp desperately at the fabric of my skirt. "Maya, please," Josephine begged, her voice cracking as tears carved dark tracks through her flawless makeup. "You have money. I know you do. I read the business reports. I know your tech company is valued at hundreds of millions of dollars. You can fix this. You have to fix this." She tilted her head back, looking up at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated panic. The desperation in her eyes was almost pitiable, but I felt absolutely nothing. "You must save this family!" Maya Josephine cried. her voice rising to a frantic, hysterical pitch that echoed violently against the high ceilings. "You have to save your sister. Chloe is pregnant. She is carrying a child. You cannot let her lose everything. You cannot let Preston go to prison. We are your blood. You have more than enough wealth to cover this debt and buy the resort back. Do not do this to us." I looked down at her hands gripping my clothes. A wave of profound revulsion washed over me. I did not yell. I did not raise my voice to match her hysteria. I simply stepped back, twisting my body sharply to break her hold. I shook her hand away as if swatting aside a poisonous insect. "You sold me out!" I stated the words falling like heavy leaden stones into the dead silence of the room. "You sold out the blood, sweat, and tears of our grandparents." Winston let out a sharp, ragged gasp, stepping back from the table as if he had been physically struck. He looked around the grand dining room, staring at the custom drapes, the expensive art, the crystal chandelier, finally understanding the true cost of his wife's vanity. "They fought redlining." I continued, my voice slicing through Josephine's sobbing with icy, unrelenting precision. "They fought segregation. They worked themselves into early graves to secure this estate so their descendants would never have to bow to anyone. They built a fortress of black generational wealth, and you took their sacred legacy and handed it over to a privileged fraud just so you could pretend you belonged at his country club. You were so desperate for proximity to whiteness, so hungry for the validation of an old money last name, that you actively destroyed everything your own family built." Chloe let out a piercing shriek, burying her face in her hands. Preston squeezed his eyes shut, unable to look at any of us, his chest heaving as a panic attack fully took hold of him. "And now," I said, my voice hardening into impenetrable steel, "you expect me to use the empire I built with my own hands to pay off his debts. You expect me to drain my accounts and use my blood, sweat and tears to bail out a man who stood in my dining room 30 minutes ago and called me a lowly IT worker. You expect me to save a fraudster who threatened to destroy my husband's career." Josephine shook her head frantically, pressing her palms against the floor. "I was only trying to secure our future," she wept, her justifications sounding hollow and pathetic. "Preston promised me shares in his holding company. He promised Chloe would have a 10% stake in the Kensington dynasty. It was an investment." I walked slowly back to the center of the mahogany table where the sleek black folder lay untouched. My fingers brushed over the matte surface. The crisp sound of the heavy paper turning was the only noise in the room, sharp and deafening. I bypassed the foreclosure notices. I bypassed the deed to the house. I flipped directly to the second page of the secondary loan agreement. I slid the document out and held it up, the bold bank insignia glaring under the bright lights of the chandelier. "But the most despicable part," I said, my eyes locking onto Josephine's terrified, tear-streaked face, "is that you did not just mortgage this house." I stepped closer, holding the document out so Winston could read the fine print at the bottom of the page. The color completely drained from my father's face as his eyes scanned the text. Preston was already drowning in toxic debt, I explained, my tone carrying the clinical absolute authority of a judge delivering a final verdict. No legitimate financial institution was going to hand him a $5 million bridge loan, even with this estate as collateral. The bank knew his portfolio was a massive risk. They required a guarantor. They needed a co-signer with perfect credit, zero debt, and massive liquid assets to secure the transfer. Josephine squeezed her eyes shut, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands, physically unable to look at the paper I was holding. She knew exactly what it was. She knew that her final unforgivable sin was finally out in the open. "You forged my signature," I declared, the revelation exploding through the room with devastating force. "You stole my social security number. You committed federal identity theft to co-sign a $5 million predatory loan for a man who openly despises us. You chained my financial future to his sinking ship just to buy your golden child a fake crown." Preston suddenly scrambled backward, his chair tipping over and crashing loudly onto the floor. He pressed himself against the wall, hyperventilating, realizing that his complicity in federal fraud was now fully documented and resting in the hands of the very woman he had just threatened to destroy. He had known about the forged signature. He had accepted the fraudulent guarantor documents to save his own skin, knowingly committing wire fraud and conspiracy. Marcus stepped out from the shadows of the room, standing solidly beside me. He did not say a word, but the cold, calculating look in his dark eyes told Preston everything he needed to know. Marcus was a corporate liquidation attorney. He knew exactly how many years in federal prison a $5 million fraudulent loan carried. Preston was not just broke. He was facing catastrophic criminal charges. Chloe stared at her mother, her carefully contoured face twisted in absolute horror. "You stole Maya's identity," Chloe gasped, her voice trembling. "You committed a felony. I did it for you," Josephine screamed back, pointing a shaking finger at her youngest daughter. "I risked everything so you could have the life you deserved. I did it so you would not have to struggle." "You did it for yourself," I corrected her, my voice dropping back to a quiet, lethal whisper. "You did it because you could not stand the thought of your friends finding out that the Kensington family was bankrupt. You could not tolerate the humiliation of losing your social status, so you decided to sacrifice my life to maintain your illusion." I tossed the forged document back onto the table. It landed exactly in front of my father. Winston stared at the fraudulent signature, his hands shaking so violently he had to grip the edge of the table just to remain standing. His entire reality, his marriage, his family legacy, and his trust in his wife had been systematically dismantled and destroyed in less than an hour. "You thought you could use my success as a blank check for your vanity." I continued, looking down at my mother as she wept on the floor. "You thought I would just remain the quiet, obedient disappointment you could manipulate in the shadows. But you forgot one crucial detail, Josephine." I leaned down slightly, making sure she saw the absolute unbroken resolve in my eyes. "I built my empire by identifying liabilities and eliminating them." I said, every word dripping with finality. "And as of this exact moment, you and Preston are no longer my family. You are simply bad debt. And I am going to let the federal authorities collect." The air in the room compressed, growing thick and unbreathable, as if the walls themselves were slowly closing in on the wreckage of the dining table. Josephine stared up at me, her chest heaving, her perfectly manicured fingernails biting into the mahogany wood as she hauled herself up from the floor. Her face was a twisted mask of desperation and deeply ingrained entitlement. She refused to accept her defeat. She refused to believe that the daughter she had treated like a peasant had somehow become the executioner of her entire social empire. "I am your mother," Josephine stammered, her voice shaking violently as she gripped the edge of the table for support. "I gave you life. I raised you. I have the right to use your information to save this family. You owe this family your success, Maya." A sharp, ringing laugh erupted from my throat. It was not a polite chuckle or a nervous sound. It was a loud, uninhibited burst of pure, victorious amusement that echoed harshly against the crystal chandelier hanging above us. "That is exactly why I love data security," I said, leaning in so close I could see the frantic pulse beating in her neck. "You are so arrogant, Mother. You are so blinded by your own narcissism that you actually believe you own me. You did not know that 3 years ago, the very morning after I discovered you had stolen my college savings to buy Chloe a designer handbag, I took complete control of my identity. I locked my social security number. I initiated a permanent ironclad credit freeze. And because of the substantial assets I was beginning to acquire, I set up a direct federal fraud alert with the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Preston stopped breathing. The color completely vanished from his face, leaving his skin as white as a sheet of printer paper. His eyes darted from the ruined documents covered in barbecue sauce back to my face. The absolute horror of his situation was finally penetrating his thick layer of unearned privilege. "You," Preston choked out, his voice cracking into a high, panicked wheeze. "You set a trap for us to sign those loan documents." I smiled, tilting my head slightly as I observed his total collapse. "I did not force you to do anything, Preston. I simply offered you a rope, and you tied the noose around your own neck." I turned my attention back to the entire room, making sure Winston and Chloe heard every single word of the systematic takedown I had orchestrated. When my firm Onyx PropTech purchased your toxic debt portfolio, I knew exactly what kind of financial coward you were, I explained, my voice ringing with cold clinical authority. I knew your commercial real estate empire was a complete illusion. I knew you had absolutely zero liquid assets to cover the margin calls. I also knew that when the secondary lenders demanded a flawless, debt-free guarantor to secure your desperate $5 million bridge loan, you would panic. You would not go to your wealthy country club friends because you could not risk them finding out you were secretly broke. You would go to Josephine because you knew she was desperate enough to do anything to keep the Kensington name attached to her daughter. Chloe let out a loud, agonizing wail. She pressed her hands over her ears, frantically shaking her head as if trying to physically block out the reality of her husband's crimes. She looked at her mother with an expression of absolute disgust. And I knew Josephine. I continued my gaze, locking onto my mother. I knew she still had copies of my old tax returns and identification from before I left for college. I knew she felt so fundamentally entitled to my existence that she would not hesitate to forge my signature to bail out her precious son-in-law. So I waited. I watched the automated alerts on my secure servers. I waited for the exact moment you submitted that fraudulent application to the federal lenders. The second you hit submit, my security protocols triggered a hard ping directly to the federal authorities. Preston grabbed the edge of his hair, pulling at the expensive styled strands as a full-blown panic attack seized his body. "You framed me," Preston yelled, stumbling backward and hitting the wall. "You set me up for federal wire fraud. I will tell the judge you entrapped me. I will tell the police you orchestrated this. You are going to tell a federal judge that my wife forced you to commit a felony?" Marcus asked, stepping forward. His deep, resonant voice cut through Preston's hysterical shouting with the effortless weight of a seasoned litigator. "That is a brilliant legal strategy, Preston. Please make sure you put that on the official record. I am sure the federal prosecutor will find it highly entertaining when they present the time-stamped digital footprint of your IP address, submitting the forged documents from your own private home office." Winston stood frozen at the head of the table. He looked at his wife, the woman he had deferred to for 30 years, the woman who had dictated every social move, every financial decision, and every cruel comment directed at me. The realization of what she had done finally shattered the last remaining fragment of his passive complicity. "You committed a federal crime," Josephine Winston said, his voice entirely hollow, stripped of all warmth and affection. "You committed identity theft against your own flesh and blood to protect a man who has been lying to us since the day he walked into this house. You have destroyed everything." "Winston, please!" Josephine cried, abandoning the table and crawling toward him on the hardwood floor. Her expensive silk dress dragged through the spilled water and pork grease. "I did not know it was a trap. I was trying to secure Chloe's future. I was trying to make sure our grandchild grew up in high society. You have to help me hire a lawyer. You have to use your retirement funds to keep me out of prison." Winston looked down at her with an expression of pure, unadulterated contempt. "I do not have a retirement fund anymore, Josephine. You mortgaged it. You leveraged the equity of this entire estate against a fraudulent loan that is now in default. We are completely bankrupt, and you are going to jail." Chloe suddenly snapped. The fragile, pampered golden child who had spent her entire life floating on the unearned labor of others violently turned on her husband. She lunged at Preston, her fists flying as she struck him repeatedly on the shoulders and chest. "You promised me a mansion in the Hamptons!" Chloe screamed, her voice tearing through her throat. "You promised me a trust fund. You promised me a nanny and a private chef. You are a broke, pathetic liar. You ruined my life. I am pregnant with a criminal's baby. I am going to be a laughingstock at the country club. Everyone is going to know we are poor." Preston weakly tried to push her away, cowering against the wall like a beaten animal. "Stop it, Chloe," Preston begged, raising his arms to shield his face. "Stop hitting me. I have to call my father. I have to find a way out of the country." "You are not going anywhere," Marcus stated casually, reaching into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out his phone, tapping the screen a few times before holding it up for Preston to see. My colleagues at the firm alerted the authorities the moment the loan defaulted this morning. The federal mandate for your arrest was signed by a judge at noon today. Right on cue, the heavy, undeniable sound of loud rhythmic pounding echoed from the grand double doors of the estate's main entrance. FBI. A booming voice shouted from the front porch, penetrating the thick mahogany doors. Open the door immediately. We have a federal warrant for the arrest of Preston Kensington and Josephine Davenport. Josephine let out a piercing, guttural scream. She collapsed onto the floor, curling into a fetal position, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her impending incarceration finally broke her mind. Her entire world, built on pristine optics designer labels and cruel manipulations, was instantly reduced to the sound of federal agents demanding entry into her home. Preston slid down the wall, hitting the floor with a pathetic thud. He pulled his knees to his chest, rocking back and forth, muttering incoherently to himself. The mighty Wall Street titan had been completely dismantled, exposed as nothing more than a desperate fraud who had tried to build a castle on a foundation of quicksand. I looked at the chaos, the weeping, the complete and total destruction of the people who had spent decades trying to convince me I was nothing. I did not feel an ounce of pity. I did not feel a shred of guilt. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of absolute peace. Marcus walked over to the dining room doors, unlocking them and swinging them open to allow the tactical team of federal agents to enter the home. The agents swarmed the grand foyer, their heavy boots tramping across the expensive imported rugs, moving swiftly toward the dining room with handcuffs ready. I reached down and picked up the pristine black folder from the table, stepping carefully over the spilled wine and the shattered remnants of my family's dinner. I walked right past my mother as an agent pulled her roughly to her feet, reading her Miranda rights over her hysterical sobbing. I walked past Preston as he was slammed against the wall and handcuffed, his designer suit wrinkling under the firm grip of the authorities. I stopped briefly in front of Winston. He was standing completely still, watching his wife being hauled away, watching his generational home being seized by the very daughter he had failed to protect. "You always told me to know my place in this family, Dad," I said softly, my voice completely steady. I finally found it. I turned and walked out the front door, slipping my hand securely into Marcus's. The sun was beginning to set over the Oak Ridge estate, casting long golden shadows across the pristine driveway. I did not look back at the flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the grand windows. I simply kept walking forward, leaving the ashes of their fake dynasty far behind me. Before my hand could even grasp the heavy brass handle of the front door, a frantic scrambling weight threw itself against the solid mahogany wood, violently slamming it shut and physically blocking my exit. The perspective of the moment seemed to shift, narrowing my focus entirely. If this were a film, the camera would be tracking tightly over my shoulder, keeping my posture calm and centered in the foreground, while deeply blurring the background. Slowly, that background pulled into sharp, horrifying focus, revealing the distorted, grotesque faces of the people I used to call family. They had scrambled out of the dining room, chasing me into the grand foyer like desperate, starving scavengers, realizing their only food source was walking away. Preston was leaning heavily against the doorframe, gasping for air as if his lungs were collapsing. The arrogant sneer of the wealthy tycoon had melted off his face, leaving behind the pale, pathetic visage of a cornered coward. His expensive silk tie was yanked loose, and a thick layer of nervous sweat plastered his blonde hair to his forehead. Beside him, Josephine was leaning on Chloe for support, her knees buckling under the weight of her impending incarceration. "Maya, you have to stop this," Preston wheezed, holding up both hands in a gesture of absolute surrender. His voice was a high, reedy pitch of sheer terror. "You own the debt now. You are the sole proprietor of Onyx PropTech. You can call the bank. You can tell them the signature was authorized. You can tell them it was a family misunderstanding. I will sign whatever you want. I will give you the properties. I will give you everything. Just call off the authorities. I stood perfectly still on the imported marble floor of the foyer, my posture radiating the absolute unshakable power of a woman who had meticulously calculated every single variable. I looked at Preston, studying the frantic pulse beating visibly in his neck. I slowly nodded my head, a gesture of profound, chilling finality. I cannot call them off. Preston, I stated, my voice echoing through the cavernous space with the cold resonance of a steel blade dropping onto a stone floor. That $5 million loan file was not just flagged by my internal acquisition algorithms. The moment Josephine submitted the digital application using my locked Social Security number, the federal fraud alert I established 3 years ago was instantly triggered. I paused, letting the silence stretch just long enough to ensure every person in the room absorbed the absolute destruction of their future. The file was automatically routed directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I continued, my tone clinical and completely devoid of mercy. You are not dealing with a simple corporate debt restructuring. You are dealing with federal charges for aggravated identity theft and major bank fraud. And the sentencing guidelines in this state are incredibly strict. For a coordinated $5 million wire fraud conspiracy for you, Preston, that is 15 years in a federal penitentiary. Minimum. The number dropped into the grand foyer like a live grenade. 15 years. Preston physically staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes slipping on the polished marble. 15 years. The reality of losing his country club memberships, his tailored suits, and his entire artificial identity crashed down upon him. He was a man who had never faced a single consequence in his life, and now he was staring down the barrel of a decade and a half in a concrete cell. His survival instinct kicked in raw and devoid of any loyalty. Preston violently shoved Chloe away from him, pointing a shaking finger directly at Josephine's face. She did it! Preston screamed, his voice cracking with hysterical cowardice. I did not sign that paper. Josephine signed it. It was her house. It was her daughter's information. I did not force her to do anything. You take her. Maya, tell them your mother acted alone. Josephine gasped, clutching her chest as if she had been physically stabbed. The man she had sacrificed her entire generational legacy for, the man she had idolized simply because of his proximity to white wealth, was eagerly throwing her to the wolves to save his own skin. You promised me, Josephine whimpered, her voice a broken, pathetic croak. You promised me we were partners, Preston. You promised me Chloe would be a queen. I promised you nothing, you greedy old fool. Preston spat back, his face twisting into an ugly mask of pure hatred. You handed me that money because you were desperate to buy your way into my world. You ruined yourself. Chloe stared at her husband, her mouth opening and closing soundlessly. The luxurious, pampered bubble she had lived in since birth had just violently popped. The illusion of her perfect marriage was gone. The man she had mocked me for not having was currently sacrificing her mother to avoid prison. The realization that she was going to be left with absolutely nothing, no money, no estate, no status, and a criminal for a husband, finally broke her fragile mind. Chloe let out a sound that did not even resemble a human voice. It was a guttural, feral shriek that tore through her throat, sounding exactly like a wounded, cornered animal. Her meticulously contoured face twisted into a mask of pure, unhinged rage. She locked her eyes on me, blaming me for exposing the rot she had eagerly built her life upon. She bared her teeth, curling her fingers into claws, and launched herself forward. Chloe lunged at me with startling speed, her expensive high heels digging into the floor as she threw her entire body weight toward my face, intent on tearing the calm, victorious expression right off my features. I did not flinch. I did not even blink. I did not have to. Before Chloe's manicured nails could come within 3 feet of my face, Marcus stepped into her path with breathtaking, lethal efficiency. He moved with the smooth, practiced grace of a man who had spent his life protecting what was his. Marcus did not throw a punch, but he used her own frantic momentum against her. He planted his feet firmly, raising his arm to intercept her upper body. He caught Chloe squarely by the shoulder, pivoting his weight and shoving her hard. The force of his block halted her momentum instantly, lifting her slightly off the ground before sending her flying backward. Chloe crashed violently onto the massive imported Persian rug that covered the center of the foyer. She hit the floor hard, her limbs tangling in the expensive fabric, her designer dress riding up her thighs as she sprawled across the ornate patterns. Marcus stood over her, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit jacket with total unbothered composure. He looked down at my sister, his dark eyes radiating an intense, uncompromising warning. "Do not ever attempt to touch my wife again." Marcus stated, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that commanded absolute submission. Chloe lay on the rug, her chest heaving as she gasped for air. She did not try to get up. She simply curled into a tight ball on the floor, burying her face in her arms and dissolving into loud, choking sobs. Her carefully constructed reality had completely collapsed, leaving her weeping on the floor of a house she no longer owned. Winston had followed them into the foyer, standing silently near the archway of the dining room. He watched his golden child hit the floor. He watched his wife cowering against the wall, and for the first time in his entire life, Winston did not rush forward to comfort them. He did not reprimand me for upsetting his favorite daughter. He simply stared at the ruins of his family, his face etched with the crushing realization that they deserved every single ounce of the destruction they were currently experiencing. I looked at the three of them, the arrogant mother, the fraudulent husband, and the spoiled sister. They were a portrait of absolute devastation, drowning in the consequences of their own greed. I felt a profound, settling calm wash over my entire body. The decades of being made to feel small, the years of swallowing their insults, the endless nights wondering why I was never good enough to earn their love, it was all completely gone, washed away by the undeniable reality of my own power. "We are leaving now," I said, addressing no one in particular. My voice was serene, floating above the sounds of Chloe's weeping and Preston's frantic hyperventilating. Marcus placed his hand firmly on the brass handle of the front door, pulling it open to the cool, crisp evening air. As the heavy door swung wide, the silence of the affluent Oak Ridge neighborhood was abruptly shattered. From the distance, cutting sharply through the still night air, came the unmistakable high-pitched wail of police sirens. The sound was faint at first, echoing off the manicured lawns and towering oak trees of the gated community, but it was growing louder by the second. The rhythmic shrieking noise multiplied, indicating not just one cruiser, but a converging fleet of federal and local authorities rushing rapidly toward the Davenport estate. The flashing red and blue lights quickly painted the manicured front lawn in violent, sweeping strokes of color. I stopped at the end of the stone walkway, Marcus standing like an impenetrable fortress beside me, and turned back to watch the finale of the masterpiece I had meticulously orchestrated. The heavy mahogany doors left wide open by Marcus just moments before invited the chaos directly into the heart of the Davenport estate. Heavily armed federal agents poured out of the black SUVs, their tactical boots hitting the pavement with terrifying synchronization. They did not pause to admire the pristine landscaping or the sweeping architectural columns. They swarmed the grand foyer, their flashlights cutting sharply through the dimming evening light, pushing straight past the crystal vases and imported rugs with absolute unforgiving authority. The sheer physical force of their entry seemed to make the very foundation of the house tremble, vibrating with the weight of impending justice. Inside the house, the atmosphere of panic escalated into pure, unfiltered terror. Preston did not even make it to the hallway. He attempted to scramble backward toward the kitchen, his expensive leather shoes losing traction on the spilled water and polished hardwood. Two federal agents closed the distance in an instant. They grabbed him by the shoulders of his bespoke suit, lifting him entirely off the floor. He thrashed weakly, shouting frantic, incoherent threats about calling his lawyers about his powerful family name, about suing the federal government for harassment. The agents were entirely unimpressed by his hollow arrogance. They hauled him forward and slammed him face first onto the dining room table. His cheek hit the exact spot where the grease-stained Kensington Trust documents rested, grinding his face into the cold, hard reality of his financial ruin. The fine china shattered onto the floor, scattering sharp fragments across the room, mimicking the complete destruction of his privileged life. The sharp metallic click of handcuffs snapping tightly around his wrists echoed loudly over his pathetic sobbing. A senior agent stood over him, firmly pinning Preston's shoulder to the mahogany wood and loudly recited the charges. Aggravated identity theft, major bank fraud, conspiracy to commit federal wire fraud. Every single word stripped away another layer of the aristocratic tycoon, exposing the desperate penniless criminal underneath. Preston wept openly, his tears mixing with the barbecue sauce on his ruined face. He begged the agents to listen to him screaming that his father would pay whatever fines were necessary, entirely forgetting that I now owned his father's debts as well. The great Preston Kensington, the man who had mocked my career and belittled my heritage, was completely paralyzed, reduced to a blubbering mess of extreme cowardice. Chloe watched her husband get pinned like a common thief, and her survival instincts kicked in with dramatic, sickening absurdity. She threw herself against the wall, clutching her flat stomach with both hands doubling over as if she had been physically struck. She began to wail, a shrill, piercing sound that cut right through the shouting of the agents. She screamed that the shock was putting her into premature labor. She cried out for an ambulance, claiming her baby was in grave danger, aggressively demanding the agents step back and show respect to a vulnerable pregnant woman. It was a spectacular performance of maternal distress, entirely undercut by the biological reality that she was barely 8 weeks along. There was no physical bump, no medical possibility of premature labor, only a desperate, privileged woman trying to weaponize a microscopic embryo to escape accountability. A female agent approached her, completely unfazed by the theatrics. The agent firmly instructed Chloe to stand up, place her hands against the wall, and produce her identification coldly, ignoring the fake medical emergency. When Chloe realized her performance was failing, that her tears held absolutely no currency with federal law enforcement, she abandoned the pregnancy routine entirely. She began screaming wildly, frantically, calling out for our mother to save her. But Josephine could not help her. My mother was sitting flat on the ruined Persian rug in the foyer, her legs splayed out in front of her like a discarded rag doll. Her meticulously styled hair was a tangled, chaotic mess, and her expensive mascara had run down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. She was completely catatonic. The pristine socialite who had spent her entire life judging the world from an untouchable pedestal was now staring blankly at the tactical boots surrounding her. A federal agent crouched down to her eye level, holding up a thick manila folder containing the arrest warrant. The agent's voice was clear and resolute, reading out the specific charges directly into her face. Complicity in financial fraud, federal identity theft, conspiracy to defraud a federal lending institution. Josephine did not blink. She did not protest. She simply rocked back and forth, her lips moving silently, her mind entirely fractured by the absolute irreversible destruction of her social empire. The mother who had stolen my college fund to buy designer bags for her favorite daughter was now being read her Miranda rights on the floor of a house she no longer owned. I could see her mouth forming the words of her country club membership number over and over again, completely disconnected from the brutal reality of her arrest. Winston stood frozen near the archway, looking like a ghost haunting his own home. The agents pushed past him, securing the perimeter, and treating the patriarch of the Davenport family like a piece of invisible furniture. He watched his wife being hauled to her feet by a federal agent. He watched his son-in-law being dragged away from the dining table in handcuffs. He had spent his entire life taking the path of least resistance, and this was his ultimate reward. Total, uncompromising isolation. I stood in the driveway, the cool night air washing over me, watching the flashing lights illuminate the terrified faces of the family I was leaving behind. The suffocating grip they had held on my life for 3 decades was permanently broken. They had built a kingdom on lies, and I had simply provided the match that burned it to the ground. Marcus gently squeezed my hand, a silent acknowledgement of the definitive victory we had just secured. I turned my back on the Davenport estate, walking toward our waiting car, leaving the sirens and the screaming to echo into the night. The frantic, disorienting chaos that had just violently torn through the Davenport estate abruptly evaporated the moment the heavy mahogany doors clicked shut behind the federal agents. If a camera were capturing this exact second, the wildly shaking handheld perspective would seamlessly transition into a slow, perfectly balanced, and utterly silent glide. The flashing red and blue lights faded down the long driveway, taking Preston and Josephine with them into the dark reality of the criminal justice system. Inside the grand dining room, the air was entirely still. The only sound was the jagged, erratic breathing of my sister. Chloe remained crumpled on the expensive Persian rug, her hands clutching her fake, non-existent baby bump as she stared at the empty doorway. She had been stripped of her fraudulent husband, her enabling mother, and her entirely manufactured social identity in a matter of minutes. Winston stood completely paralyzed amidst the wreckage of his own cowardice. He looked at the overturned crystal goblets, the dark stains soaking into the pristine white tablecloth, and the grease-smeared financial documents that had sealed their ruin. Finally, he turned his head and looked at me. His eyes were bloodshot, hollowed out by a lifetime of choosing the path of least resistance. "Are you truly going to let them take your mother away in handcuffs?" Winston asked. His voice was a pathetic, trembling whisper that barely carried across the room. He looked around the high ceilings and the expensive artwork, his face crumbling with grief. "And this house? Maya, the bank is going to foreclose on everything my grandparents built. The legacy they suffered to create is completely gone. We have lost it all." I looked at the man who had stood by silently while his wife stole my college savings. I looked at the father who had allowed his youngest daughter to be treated like a peasant in her own home simply to avoid an argument. I felt absolutely no pity for his tears. I turned slightly toward Marcus. My husband did not need me to speak. He anticipated my exact move, reaching smoothly into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He withdrew a single crisp document, folded perfectly into thirds. He placed it directly into my outstretched hand. "The bank is not foreclosing on this property, Dad," I stated, my voice echoing with a cold, absolute authority that commanded the entire room. Winston blinked, wiping a trembling hand across his face. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his confusion pulling him briefly out of his despair. "Josephine signed the loan. She put the deed up as collateral. The bank will seize it the moment the market opens on Monday." I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. "There is no bank anymore, Winston," I explained, maintaining direct, unwavering eye contact with him. When Preston defaulted on his massive commercial payments, his secondary lenders panicked. They packaged his entire toxic debt portfolio and sold it at a steep discount to liquidate their risk. My private equity fund, Onyx PropTech, purchased that portfolio in its entirety. I own Preston's debts. I own his commercial properties. And I own the secondary bridge loan that Josephine fraudulently guaranteed with this estate. I raised my hand and let the crisp piece of paper slip from my fingers. It fluttered gracefully through the silent air, landing perfectly in the center of the ruined dining table, right over the dark stain of spilled wine. "Meaning the person foreclosing on this house is me," I declared. Winston stared at the paper. It was the official property transfer deed, stamped with the federal seal and completely finalized. The blood drained from his face as the absolute magnitude of my power finally registered in his mind. "Grandma and Grandpa's legacy home is now officially in my name," I said, my tone completely devoid of mercy. "You do not have to worry about a faceless corporate bank seizing the physical labor of your ancestors. The estate is staying exactly where it belongs. It is staying with the only Davenport who actually knows the value of hard work." Chloe let out a pathetic whimper from the floor. She slowly pushed herself up onto her knees, her designer dress wrinkled and stained. "Maya, please," Chloe begged, her voice hoarse and broken. "Where am I supposed to go? Preston's accounts are frozen by the FBI. Mother is in jail. I have absolutely nothing left. You cannot just throw me out on the street." I looked down at the golden child. The sister who had mocked my intelligence paraded her fraudulent wealth in my face and gleefully benefited from the money our mother had stolen from my education. "Mother and Chloe have exactly 30 days to clear their garbage out of here," I stated, addressing Winston but keeping my eyes locked on my sister. "You can hire a moving truck, or you can drag your designer luggage down the driveway by hand. I genuinely do not care how you manage it. But on the 31st day, the locks will be changed, the security system will be updated, and anyone found trespassing on my property will be arrested immediately. Winston collapsed into one of the dining chairs, dropping his head into his hands. What are you going to do with a house this size, Maya? He wept into his palms. You already live in a luxury penthouse. Are you just going to sell it? Are you going to tear it down? I smiled, a sharp, victorious expression that finally laid decades of injustice to rest. I am going to honor the legacy you failed to protect, I replied smoothly. 30 years ago, Josephine stole my full academic scholarship money to buy Chloe a Himalayan crocodile handbag so she could fit in with her wealthy, privileged sorority sisters. She tried to permanently sabotage my education to fund an illusion. I gestured around the grand dining room, taking in the crystal, the mahogany, and the sheer scale of the generational wealth that now belonged entirely to me. I am converting this entire estate into the primary headquarters for a new philanthropic foundation. I announced, every word ringing with poetic, undeniable justice. I am establishing a massive, fully funded scholarship program. It will be dedicated exclusively to self-made Black women who need financial backing to pursue degrees in technology, engineering, and business. The money Josephine stole from me is going to fund the education of hundreds of brilliant women just like me. They will walk through these front doors, they will sit in this exact dining room, and they will build their own empires right on top of the ashes of your vanity. Winston closed his eyes, fresh tears leaking out from beneath his eyelids. He had absolutely nothing left to say. There were no arguments left to make, no excuses left to offer. The absolute irrefutable justice of my decision completely silenced him. I turned away from the table, stepping past my weeping sister without a single downward glance. Marcus was waiting for me by the entrance, his posture straight and his expression filled with an intense, quiet pride. I slipped my arm through his, feeling the solid, comforting weight of the partnership we had built together. We walked out of the Davenport estate, our footsteps echoing in the grand foyer one final time. The heavy front door clicked firmly shut behind us, sealing Winston and Chloe inside the physical tomb of their own catastrophic failures. I took a deep breath of the crisp night air, looking up at the clear, starry sky. The debt was paid in full, the power had officially changed hands, and my empire was just beginning to rise. The drive back to the city was wrapped in a comfortable, absolute silence. Marcus drove smoothly through the winding roads of Oak Ridge, the flashing lights of the police cruisers fading into the rearview mirror until they were completely swallowed by the darkness. I watched the city skyline come into view, the towering glass structures reflecting the promise of a future I had built entirely with my own hands. I did not feel a single ounce of remorse. True justice is rarely soft, and it is never apologetic. By Monday morning, the fallout was spectacular and absolute. The financial sector is a notoriously ruthless ecosystem, and the scent of blood in the water attracts sharks with terrifying speed. Preston's catastrophic collapse made the front page of every major business publication. Wall Street Titan, exposed in $5 million federal fraud. The articles detailed the absolute illusion of his real estate empire, the toxic debt he had been hiding, and the desperate criminal lengths he went to in order to cover his margin calls. The very elite circles he had bragged about, the men who supposedly invited him to private golf outings and exclusive galas, severed all ties before the market even opened. His assets were entirely frozen, his firm was dissolved, and he was denied bail, deemed a flight risk due to his frantic documented attempts to flee the country. Josephine's descent was even more poetic. The country club she had idolized, the institution she had treated as her personal kingdom, revoked her membership by noon. The wealthy friends she had spent decades currying favor with, the women she had gossiped with while deliberately excluding me, suddenly developed severe amnesia. When she desperately tried to call them for bail money from the county holding facility, not a single one picked up the phone. They treated her exactly how she had treated me, like an embarrassment that needed to be erased. The 30 days I had given Winston and Chloe to vacate the estate passed with agonizing humiliation for them. I did not send representatives. I did not communicate through lawyers. I simply watched the security feed from my pristine penthouse, as the reality of their new poverty set in. Without Preston's non-existent wealth, and with Josephine's accounts locked by the federal government, they could not afford professional movers. I watched through the digital lenses as Chloe stripped of her designer labels and the fake baby bump she had used for sympathy, dragged cheap cardboard boxes down the sweeping front steps. Her face was pale, her posture completely broken. Winston moved like a hollow shell of a man carrying trash bags filled with whatever basic necessities they were allowed to keep. They loaded their pathetic remnants into a rented, dented moving van. There was no grandeur left. There was no legacy. There was only the quiet, devastating shuffle of people who had gambled their souls for an illusion and lost everything. On the 31st day, the transformation began. I did not just take the house, I systematically eradicated their memory from it. The heavy, oppressive velvet drapes were torn down to let the natural sunlight flood the grand rooms. The dark, pretentious oil paintings were removed and replaced with bright, modern art. The very dining table where Preston had been handcuffed, where Josephine had signed the fraudulent documents, was dismantled and thrown into a wood chipper. In its place, we installed sleek, collaborative workstations. The generational home built on arrogance and exclusion was officially reborn as the Onyx Foundation, a fully funded sanctuary dedicated to providing full-ride scholarships, mentorship, and venture capital to self-made women of color who had been overlooked by the system. The space that was once used to make me feel small was now a launching pad for hundreds of brilliant women to become giants. The transition is seamless as the chaotic, fast-paced energy of the past few months finally settles into a smooth, deliberate stillness. The perspective shifts, the camera slowly pulling back in a steady, fluid motion. The focus adjusts, capturing the pristine elegance of my newly renovated penthouse suite, overlooking the glittering city below. The atmosphere is quiet, heavy with the undeniable weight of absolute victory. I lean back into the plush fabric of the white leather sofa, moving with a relaxed, unbothered grace. I slowly cross my legs, the soft rustle of expensive silk filling the quiet room. In my right hand, the delicate crystal stem of a wineglass catches the ambient light, the deep, rich crimson of the Cabernet swirling gently as I raise it. I look directly into the camera. My expression is entirely calm, devoid of any lingering hurt or residual anger. A slow, sharp smile curves the corners of my mouth, a smile that is equal parts ice and profound satisfaction. That day they chose the fake baby shower of a fraud over my wedding. I say, my voice steady, carrying the cool, uncompromising resonance of a woman who owns her entire world. They called me socially unfit. They told me I did not know how to interact in their elite circles, that my presence was an embarrassment to their carefully curated image. I paused, letting the soft glow of the city lights reflect in my eyes. But they forgot one crucial thing. I continue, my gaze locking onto the lens with piercing clarity. In the world of money and power, you do not need to be socially fit to be heard. You do not need to play their pathetic little games or beg for an invitation to their table. I lean forward slightly, the crystal glass perfectly balanced in my hand. You just need to own the table they are eating at. I am not angry that they missed my wedding. I did not orchestrate this because my feelings were hurt. I simply ensured that it was the last luxury event they would ever have the privilege to decline in this lifetime. I raised the glass in a slow, silent toast to the quiet room, taking a measured sip of the dark red wine. I lower the glass, setting it down onto the polished marble coffee table. Clink. The sharp, ringing sound cuts through the silence, absolute and final. The screen slowly fades to black, leaving only the perfect, undeniable echo of a dynasty completely overthrown. The story of Maya teaches us a profound lesson about the true nature of power, independence, and self-worth. When you are constantly diminished, belittled, and treated as an outcast by the very people who are supposed to protect you, the most effective response is never to beg for their acceptance. Instead, true vindication comes from quietly building your own foundation. Maya's journey illustrates that financial independence and unshakable self-reliance are the ultimate shields against manipulation and toxic entitlement. Blood relations do not automatically guarantee loyalty or love. Her family mistook her silence for weakness, and her patience for submission, completely failing to realize that she was meticulously securing her own future while they built their entire lives on a fragile illusion. The ultimate justice in life does not always require you to scream or fight aggressively. Sometimes justice is simply allowing deceitful people to face the natural devastating consequences of their own actions. Maya did not destroy her family. They destroyed themselves through their greed and arrogance, and she simply removed the safety net. Ultimately, you do not need to fit into someone else's broken system to be successful. You just need the courage to walk away and build your own empire. If you have ever had to cut toxic ties to build your own success, share your experience in the comments below and subscribe for more stories of ultimate vindication.